The sun had long set over the bustling city, casting long shadows across the skyline. For Grace, the night marked yet another late shift at the newspaper office, where the glow of her computer screen was the only light she needed. As a successful journalist, Grace had learned to find comfort in the solitude of her work, even as her personal life lay in ruins. Her recent divorce had been bitter, leaving her heart bruised and her trust shattered. But Grace had buried her pain deep beneath the layers of her career, focusing on stories that made the world around her seem less chaotic than the one inside her own mind. That night, Grace decided to call it a day, though her heart felt heavier than usual. She couldn't shake the strange sense of loneliness that lingered, despite the vibrant life of the city outside her window. As she rode the elevator down to her apartment, she thought about how far she had come since the divorce, yet how little she had healed. Across town, Steve Lockwood was finishing up his shift at Fire Station 23. For Steve, firefighting wasn't just a job. It was his life, the only thing that made sense after losing his wife in a tragic car accident 2 years ago. The memory of her still haunted him, her laughter, and the way she used to make their home feel warm and alive. Now, that home felt as empty as his heart. His brother, Matt, and the other firefighters at the station had done everything they could to help Steve move forward, but the weight of his grief held him back, tethering him to the past. As Steve settled into the quiet of the firehouse, his thoughts drifted to that fateful day. It wasn't just the loss of his wife that crushed him. It was the feeling that he had failed, that he hadn't been able to save her, despite his life being dedicated to saving others. Just as Steve closed his eyes for a moment of reprieve, the blaring sound of the fire alarm cut through the silence like a knife. "We've got a structure fire 5 alarm. Apartment building downtown." The dispatcher's voice crackled over the speaker. Without hesitation, Steve and his crew jumped into action, adrenaline surging through their veins as they raced to the scene. Meanwhile, Grace was in her apartment, exhausted from the day's work and the emotional toll of reliving her past. She had just settled onto the couch when the acrid smell of smoke began to creep under her door. At first, she dismissed it as someone cooking or maybe a neighbor burning a candle. But as the minutes passed, the smell intensified, and then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of crackling fire. Throwing open her front door, Grace was met with thick, black smoke billowing down the hallway. Her heart pounded in her chest as fear gripped her. She raced back inside, searching for her phone, her keys, anything she could grab. But before she could even think about an escape plan, the fire alarms in her building erupted, and the reality of the situation hit her like a ton of bricks. She was trapped. Outside, the fire truck screeched to a halt, and Steve and his crew wasted no time getting to work. Flames shot out of the windows of the upper floors, licking the sky like angry serpents. It was chaos, and the heat was unbearable, even from a distance. Steve's instincts kicked in, and he led his team into the burning building, fully aware that lives were hanging in the balance. Grace coughed as the smoke filled her lungs, her eyes stinging from the fumes. She stumbled toward the window, desperately trying to get fresh air, but all she could see was the growing blaze below. Her apartment was quickly filling with smoke, and the flames were moving closer. She was suffocating, and her mind raced with the thought that this might be the end. And then, through the haze of smoke and fire, Grace heard it, a voice, strong and reassuring. "Is anyone in here?" the voice called. Her heart leapt in her chest as she saw a figure emerge through the door, a firefighter, clad in full gear, moving swiftly through the flames. It was Steve. Without wasting a second, he grabbed her arm, his grip firm yet gentle, guiding her toward the door. "Stay close to me," he commanded, his voice calm but urgent. Grace could hardly see through the smoke, but Steve's presence was a lifeline. She followed him, clinging to the hope that she would make it out alive. Every second felt like an eternity as they made their way through the burning building, the heat so intense it felt as if the walls were closing in on them. At last, they burst through the exit, fresh air hitting Grace like a wave of relief. She collapsed onto the pavement, gasping for breath, her body shaking with adrenaline and fear. Steve knelt beside her, his face hidden behind his helmet, but his concern was evident in the way he checked to make sure she was okay. "You're safe now," he said, his voice steady, though his heart was still racing from the intensity of the rescue. Grace looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. She had never been so close to death, and yet, here she was alive because of this stranger. The aftermath of the fire left Grace's apartment a smoldering ruin, her possessions destroyed. She stood outside the building, wrapped in a blanket that one of the paramedics had given her, watching as the firefighters worked tirelessly to extinguish the remaining flames. Her entire world felt like it had been reduced to ash in a matter of minutes. Steve watched from a distance as Grace stared at the ruins of her home. There was something about her that tugged at him, a vulnerability that mirrored his own. He had seen so many people go through disasters, but something about this woman stayed with him. He wanted to check on her to make sure she was truly all right, but he hesitated. He wasn't sure why he felt so drawn to her, but he couldn't shake the feeling. Later that night, after the flames had finally been subdued, Grace found herself at a nearby hotel, courtesy of the Red Cross. She couldn't sleep, her mind replaying the events of the night over and over. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the fire, felt the heat, and heard the crackling of the flames. And then there was Steve, the firefighter who had saved her life. His face remained a mystery to her, hidden behind the mask and gear, but his voice, his presence, it lingered in her mind. The next morning, Grace returned to the site of the fire, hoping to salvage whatever she could. The smell of smoke still hung heavy in the air, and as she sifted through the charred remains of her apartment, a deep sense of loss washed over her. She had lost so much more than just her belongings. She had lost her sense of safety, of control. She had always been the one telling the stories, but now she was living one, and it felt terrifying. Just as she was about to leave, she saw Steve again. He was with his crew, inspecting the damage. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the chaos of the world seemed to fade away. "Grace, right?" he asked, walking over to her. She nodded, surprised that he remembered her name. "Yeah, you're Steve." He smiled, though there was a sadness in his eyes that Grace couldn't quite place. "How are you holding up?" Grace shrugged, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to figure out what comes next." Steve nodded, understanding all too well the feeling of being lost in the aftermath of a tragedy. "It's going to take some time, but you'll get through it." Grace looked at him, her heart pounding for reasons she couldn't fully understand. There was something about Steve that made her feel safe, in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. Over the next few weeks, Grace and Steve's paths continued to cross, almost as if fate had decided they needed each other. Grace, ever the journalist, decided to write a piece on first responders, focusing on the emotional toll their jobs took. She reached out to Steve, asking if he would be willing to be interviewed for the story. At first, Steve hesitated. He wasn't used to talking about himself, especially not about the emotional side of his job. But something about Grace made him feel comfortable, like he could let down his guard, even if just for a little while. The interview took place at a small cafe near the firehouse. As Grace set up her recorder, Steve watched her, noticing how her hands shook just slightly. He realized she was still dealing with the trauma of the fire, just as he was still dealing with the loss of his wife. They were both wounded, both carrying scars that weren't entirely visible. "Tell me about what it's like being a firefighter," Grace asked, her voice soft but steady. "Not just the action, but how do you cope with the emotional side of it?" Steve paused, considering her question. "It's not easy," he admitted. "Every time we go into a fire, there's a chance we won't come out. And even when we do, sometimes we can't save everyone. That's the hardest part." Grace listened intently, her heart aching for him. "Do you ever get used to it?" Steve shook his head. "No, you just learn to live with it." The conversation took a deeper turn, with Steve opening up about his late wife for the first time in years. He told Grace about how they had met, how she had been his anchor, and how losing her had left him adrift. Grace, in turn, shared her own pain from her divorce, the feeling of betrayal that had shattered her trust and love. They sat in that cafe for hours talking about life, loss, and everything in between. And as the sun began to set, Both Grace and Steve realized that they had found something in each other, something they hadn't even known they were looking for. The days turned into weeks, and Grace's article on first responders began to take shape. Every conversation with Steve brought her deeper into a world she had only glimpsed from the surface, one of bravery, sacrifice, and the quiet resilience that people like Steve embodied. Each time they met, the walls around both of their hearts seemed to crumble just a little more. Grace found herself thinking about him in moments she didn't expect, replaying his words and the way he spoke about his late wife with such tenderness and sorrow. Steve had lost something so vital, yet here he was still pushing forward, still finding ways to save others. It was impossible for her not to be drawn to his strength and vulnerability. For Steve, Grace became a beacon of light in his dark world. Her presence was a gentle reminder that there was more to life than just loss, that maybe, just maybe, he could find happiness again. Her laughter, her determination, the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her passion for journalism. These small moments made Steve realize how much he had missed connecting with someone. With Grace, he felt alive again. One evening, Grace invited Steve to join her at a charity event for first responders. It was a formal affair, one she usually attended alone, but this time, she couldn't imagine going without him. When Steve arrived at her apartment to pick her up, he was struck by how beautiful she looked. Dressed in a sleek, dark gown that accentuated her graceful figure, she looked every bit the strong, confident woman he had come to know. Yet, there was a softness in her smile that made Steve's heart skip a beat. "You look stunning," he managed to say, feeling uncharacteristically nervous. Grace smiled, a blush creeping up her cheeks. "Thanks, you clean up pretty well yourself." As they drove to the event, there was a comfortable silence between them, the kind that only comes when two people are in sync. Steve found himself stealing glances at her, wondering how this remarkable woman had entered his life so unexpectedly. At the event, they mingled with other guests, but Steve found himself unable to focus on anyone but Grace. There was something about the way she carried herself, the way she laughed and engaged with others, that made him feel like the world had faded away, leaving only the two of them. Grace, too, felt the shift in the air between them. She had always prided herself on her independence, on not needing anyone. But with Steve, she felt safe in a way she hadn't felt in years. As the night wore on, they found themselves on the dance floor, the soft strains of a love ballad filling the air. Steve hesitated at first, but Grace took his hand, leading him into the dance. Their bodies moved in perfect harmony, and for the first time in years, Steve felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel. Hope. "I'm really glad you're here," Grace said softly, looking up at him. Steve's gaze softened as he met her eyes. "I am too." They danced in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken feelings hanging between them. Grace's heart raced as she wondered if Steve felt the same way she did, if he too was battling the fear of letting someone new into his life. As the song ended, Steve gently pulled her closer, his hand lingering on the small of her back. "Grace," he began, his voice low and hesitant. "I don't know what this is between us, but I haven't felt like this in a long time." Grace's breath caught in her throat. She had been trying to keep her emotions in check, not wanting to get hurt again. But in that moment, standing in Steve's arms, she realized she didn't want to fight it anymore. "I feel it too," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But I'm scared." Steve nodded, understanding all too well the fear that came with opening up again. "I am too. But maybe we don't have to be scared anymore." Grace looked up at him, her heart pounding in her chest. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to be vulnerable, to let someone in, and in Steve's eyes, she saw the same fear, but also the same hope. In that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't just attraction or chemistry. It was something deeper, something that had the potential to heal the wounds they had both carried for so long. After that night, things between Steve and Grace began to change. What had started as a friendship, born from a shared trauma, blossomed into something more. They spent more time together, not just talking about their past, but dreaming of a future. Grace found herself smiling more, feeling lighter in a way she hadn't in years. And Steve? Well, Steve began to realize that maybe, just maybe, he could love again. But as with any new relationship, doubts lingered in the shadows. One afternoon, as Grace and Steve sat on a park bench overlooking the city, the conversation took a more serious turn. "Do you ever think about your wife?" Grace asked, her voice soft but steady. She had been thinking about it for a while, wondering how Steve felt about moving on. Steve was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I think about her every day," he admitted. "I'll never stop missing her. But for the first time, I'm starting to feel like I can move forward. Like I can let go of the past without letting go of her memory." Grace nodded, understanding the delicate balance Steve was trying to maintain. "I don't want to replace her," she said softly. "I just want to be a part of your life, in whatever way that means." Steve turned to her, his eyes filled with a tenderness that took Grace's breath away. "You're not replacing her, Grace. You're helping me see that there's still love left in the world for me, that I can be happy again." Grace's heart swelled with emotion as she reached out, taking his hand in hers. "I think we both deserve to be happy." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. Grace and Steve spent more time together, falling into a rhythm that felt natural and easy. They laughed together, shared stories of their lives before they met, and planned for the future. It wasn't always perfect. There were moments of hesitation, of fear creeping back in, but they faced it together, knowing that what they had was worth fighting for. One evening, as they walked along the waterfront, Steve stopped suddenly, pulling Grace close. "I know we've both been through a lot," he began, his voice soft yet firm. "But I want you to know that I'm all in. I want to build a life with you, Grace. I'm ready." Tears welled in Grace's eyes as she looked up at him, her heart bursting with happiness. "I'm ready too," she whispered. And in that moment, beneath the glow of the city lights and the gentle waves lapping against the shore, Steve kissed her, a kiss filled with all the emotions they had been holding back for so long. It was a kiss of healing, of hope, and of the promise of a future they never thought they would have. Grace and Steve's love story wasn't a fairy tale. There were no knights in shining armor or damsels in distress. It was a story of two broken people who found each other in the aftermath of tragedy and built something beautiful from the ashes. They didn't rush into things, but over time, their love deepened, growing stronger with every passing day. Steve continued his work as a firefighter, but he no longer carried the weight of his past alone. Grace was by his side, her love and support giving him the strength to move forward. And for Grace, Steve was the anchor she had been searching for, the person who made her believe in love again. They moved in together, blending their lives in a way that felt natural and right. And though they both carried scars from their pasts, they no longer defined them. Instead, those scars became a testament to their resilience, to the fact that they had survived, and that they had found each other. In the end, their love wasn't about grand gestures or dramatic declarations. It was about the quiet moments, the laughter over morning coffee, the comfort of holding each other after a long day, the way their hearts beat in sync when they were together. For Grace and Steve, their happily ever after wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. Hope you enjoyed this story. Don't forget to like it and subscribe to our channel. Your participation is essential so that we can continue to bring you more incredible stories. Share it with your friends to help our channel grow. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.